Right now, as you are watching this, America's closest ally, its neighbour, its defence partner for over 6 decades, just told the Pentagon no. Canada, the country that shares the longest undefended border with the United States, is walking away from a multi-billion-dollar American fighter jet deal, and Washington did not see it coming. What I am about to reveal goes far beyond what mainstream media is reporting. Behind closed doors, diplomatic threats were made, phone calls were exchanged, and a sitting president personally warned a prime minister that there would be consequences. This is not just about fighter jets. This is about who controls the future of Western defence. If you want to understand the biggest power shift inside the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in decades, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because this story is developing fast. To understand how we got here, you need to go back to the beginning. Canada has been flying the CF-eighteen Hornets since the mid-1980s. For nearly 4 decades, these jets have been the backbone of the Royal Canadian Air Force, patrolling the second largest airspace on Earth, scrambling to intercept Russian bombers near the Arctic, and standing shoulder to shoulder with American pilots under the North American Aerospace Defense Command. But by the early 2000s, everyone knew the Hornets were running out of time. The airframes were aging, the technology was falling behind, and Canada needed a replacement. Enter the F-35 Lightning II, built by Lockheed Martin, the crown jewel of American military aviation. Stealth capability, advanced sensor fusion, real-time data sharing across allied forces, everything a modern fighter should be. Canada had been part of the F-35 program for years, paying into its development, contributing to the industrial supply chain, and planning for the day when 88 of these jets would replace every single Hornet in the fleet. On paper, it was a done deal. The contracts were moving forward, the budget was allocated, and the delivery schedule was set. Washington treated it as a formality, just another Allied purchase in a long line of nations lining up to buy America's most advanced weapon system. And for a while, nobody questioned it. NATO allies were adopting the F-35 one after another. The United Kingdom, Australia, Japan, Italy, the Netherlands, all of them signed on. It felt inevitable. Canada was simply next in line, and no one in Washington expected any resistance. The Pentagon had every reason to believe this was settled. After all, Canada and the United States have been defence partners since 1958. Their militaries train together, fly together, and defend the continent together. Why would Ottawa walk away from the most advanced fighter jet ever built? But here is what Washington missed. Inside Ottawa, a very different conversation was taking shape. Behind the official statements and budget documents, Canadian defence officials were asking questions that had nothing to do with radar cross-sections or missile payloads. They were asking something far more dangerous to the existing power structure. Who actually controls these jets after we buy them? Who owns the software? Who decides when we can upgrade? And what happens if the country selling us these planes decides to use that control as leverage? Those questions changed everything. And then a phone call from Stockholm made it real. Sweden's Saab corporation did not just knock on Canada's door. They kicked it open with an offer that nobody in Washington expected. The Gripen E, a 4th-generation plus fighter jet, battle-tested, NATO-compatible, and already flying with air forces in Sweden, Brazil, Hungary, and the Czech Republic. But the jet itself was not the bombshell. The deal was, Saab did not simply offer to sell Canada a fighter plane. They offered to build it there. A full domestic production line, partnered with Bombardier, one of Canada's most iconic aerospace companies. Manufacturing centres in Ontario and Quebec, regional maintenance and upgrade facilities spread across the country, and a number that made headlines across Ottawa, up to 12,600 new jobs directly tied to fighter jet production on Canadian soil. For a government already under pressure on cost of living and industrial growth, this was not just a defence proposal. It was an economic lifeline. But the real power of the Gripen offer had nothing to do with jobs or factory locations. It was about something Washington has spent decades making sure no ally ever gets full control. Let me explain what that means, because this is the part most people do not understand. When a country buys the F-35, it does not just get an aircraft. It gets plugged into a system called the Autonomic Logistics Information System, now being replaced by a cloud-based platform called Odin. These systems handle everything: maintenance scheduling, software updates, mission planning, electronic warfare libraries, and every single one of those functions runs through servers controlled by the United States. That means Canada could spend billions on these jets and still not fully own what happens inside them. If Washington decides to delay a software update, restrict access to certain mission data, or slow down spare parts delivery, there is very little Ottawa can do about it. In the middle of a trade war, a political standoff, or a diplomatic crisis, that dependency becomes a weapon without ever firing a shot. The Gripen operates on a completely different philosophy. Once delivered, the software belongs to the buyer. Weapons integration stays under national authority. Mission data is stored domestically. Upgrades and modifications can be performed by Canadian engineers in Canadian facilities without asking anyone for permission. Sweden designed it this way on purpose, because Sweden itself is a neutral country that has always valued operational independence above all else. So when Canadian officials sat down and compared these two offers side by side, they were not just looking at flight performance or stealth ratings. They were looking at a fundamental choice between two visions of national defence, one where you fly under someone else's digital roof, and one where you own the house. And when the Pentagon realised Canada was seriously considering the second option, the reaction was unlike anything diplomats had seen in years. What happened next did not make the front pages. It did not show up in press conferences or official statements. But behind the closed doors of embassies and secure phone lines, Washington launched a full pressure campaign unlike anything seen between these two allies in modern history. According to defence insiders with direct knowledge of the discussions, messages were sent through diplomatic back channels within days of Canada's Gripen review becoming public. These were not polite suggestions or friendly reminders between partners. They carried a tone that seasoned diplomats described as unmistakable. Choose the Gripen, and there will be consequences. The warnings touched on intelligence sharing agreements that have been in place for decades. They referenced joint operations under the North American Aerospace Defense Command, a partnership that has protected North American skies since 1958. And they hinted at something even more alarming, that Canada's standing within the broader NATO intelligence framework could be quietly downgraded if Ottawa walked away from the F-35. Think about what that means for a moment. The United States, Canada's closest military ally, the country it shares a continental defence shield with, was essentially telling its neighbour that buying a different fighter jet from a fellow NATO-aligned nation could damage a 66-year-old security relationship. That is not partnership. That is leverage. And then it went higher. President Donald Trump, who had already been pressuring Canada on multiple fronts, including tariffs on Canadian aerospace parts and public comments about annexation, personally weighed in. Trump issued a direct warning to Prime Minister Carney, making it clear that Washington viewed the Gripen review not as a procurement decision, but as a strategic betrayal. The message was blunt. America builds the best fighter jets in the world. Buying from anyone else is not just a bad deal, it is a statement. And statements have consequences. Now, in the past, this kind of pressure has worked. Most allied nations, when faced with that level of diplomatic heat from Washington, quietly fall in line. They renegotiate timelines, adjust budgets, find a way to make the American option work no matter the cost. That is how the system has operated for decades. The United States builds the weapons, allies buy them, and everyone stays inside the architecture that Washington controls. But Canada did something that almost no one expected. Ottawa did not fold. Canadian officials responded through their own channels with a position that was calm, measured, and devastating in its clarity. Canada's air sovereignty is non-negotiable. The decision on what aircraft defends Canadian skies will be made by Canada based on Canadian interests, and no amount of outside pressure will change that. That single statement, delivered without drama, without theatrics, sent shockwaves through the Pentagon. Not because of what it said, but because of what it represented. A trusted ally, one of the most loyal partners in the Western Alliance, had drawn a line, and in doing so, Canada exposed a truth that Washington has spent decades trying to keep buried. But here is the part no one is talking about. The real reason Washington is terrified has nothing to do with Canada itself. It is about what happens next. And that is where this story takes its most dangerous turn. Inside the Pentagon, the fear is not about losing one fighter jet contract. It is about losing the system. Because if Canada, America's most trusted, most integrated, most geographically essential ally, can look at the F-35 and say no, then every other country currently locked into the American defense ecosystem is going to start asking the same question. And that is the domino Washington cannot afford to fall. Let me show you why this matters far beyond Ottawa. Right now, the F-35 program is the most expensive military project in human history. Not the most expensive aircraft, the most expensive single project ever undertaken by any nation on Earth. The total lifetime cost is estimated at $1.7 trillion. That number is not a typo, trillion with a T. And that cost is shared across every partner nation that signed on to buy, maintain and operate these jets for the next 4 decades. The entire financial model depends on allied nations staying in the program and continuing to pay their share. Now imagine what happens if they start leaving. Finland, which shares an 800-mile border with Russia and just joined NATO in 2023, has been watching Canada's review closely. Norway, which already operates the F-35 but has raised concerns about maintenance costs and software dependency, is paying attention. Australia, South Korea, Japan, all of them have invested billions into the program. But all of them have also quietly expressed frustration about the same thing Canada is now challenging openly. Who controls the technology after the check clears? The model the United States built after the Cold War is elegant but fragile. Sell the most advanced weapons in the world, make them so deeply integrated into shared command systems that allies cannot operate independently, even if they wanted to. Lock their maintenance, their software, their upgrades into American-controlled pipelines, and then, without ever saying it out loud, you have created a defense architecture where loyalty is not optional. It is engineered. Canada just proved that model can be questioned, and the moment one country questions it successfully, others will follow. That is not speculation. That is how strategic precedent works. Momentum reshapes alliances faster than any new weapon system ever could. And here is the part that should worry every American taxpayer. If allied nations begin reducing their F-35 orders or diversifying their fleets, the cost per unit goes up for everyone who stays in. That means the United States, which plans to buy over 2,400 of these jets for its own military, will absorb a larger share of the program's astronomical cost. The burden does not disappear, it shifts, and it shifts directly onto the American defense budget, which is already under immense pressure. Canada's F-35 purchase alone has already exceeded original estimates by roughly $8 billion. Multiply that pattern across a dozen partner nations reconsidering their commitments, and you begin to see the scale of what Washington is really afraid of. So if you think this story is just about Canada buying a Swedish fighter jet, think again. This is about the financial and strategic architecture of American power, and it is showing cracks that no one in Washington knows how to fix. But wait, because what Canada is planning next goes even further than anyone expected. There is a reason Canada is not just looking at the Gripen as a quick replacement. Ottawa is playing a much longer game, and when you understand the full picture, you realise this is not about buying a fighter jet. This is about rebuilding an entire national capability that Canada lost decades ago. Let me take you to the Arctic, because that is where this story becomes real. Canada must defend the second largest airspace on the planet. Its northern territory stretches across vast Arctic regions where temperatures drop to extremes that push both machines and humans to their absolute limits. Infrastructure is minimal, runways are scarce, supply lines are long and fragile, and the threat is growing every single year. Russian bomber patrols near Canadian Arctic approaches have increased significantly. New shipping lanes are opening as ice levels shrink. And military strategists on both sides of the Atlantic agree that the Arctic is becoming one of the most contested spaces on Earth. Now ask yourself a critical question. Which aircraft do you want defending that territory? one that requires complex digital infrastructure, centralized logistics hubs, and constant connectivity to American servers to function at full capacity, or one that was specifically designed to operate from highways, temporary airstrips, and remote forward positions with minimal ground support. Sweden built the Gripen with exactly this scenario in mind. Swedish defence doctrine has always assumed that large air bases would be the first targets destroyed in any conflict. So they engineered an aircraft that can be refueled, rearmed, and turned around by a small crew in minutes, using basic equipment in the harshest conditions imaginable. That is not a sales pitch. That is a design philosophy born out of strategic necessity, and it maps almost perfectly onto Canada's Arctic defence challenge. But here is where Ottawa's vision goes beyond the Gripen itself. Defence sources indicate that Canada is actively exploring participation in the Global Combat Air Programme, a sixth-generation fighter development project being led by the United Kingdom, Japan, and Italy. Joining this programme as a Tier 1 partner would give Canadian engineers a seat at the design table for the next era of military aviation. It would mean Canadian intellectual property, Canadian innovation, and Canadian control over the technology from day one. This is deeply significant because Canada has not built a complete fighter aircraft since the Avro Arrow was cancelled in 1959. That cancellation devastated the Canadian aerospace industry and sent thousands of elite engineers south to the United States, many of whom went on to work for NASA and American defence contractors. It remains one of the most painful decisions in Canadian industrial history. What Saab and the Global Combat Air Programme are offering together is something Canada has not had in over 60 years. The chance to build again, to own again, to control its own defence future without asking permission from anyone. And that brings us to the most uncomfortable question of all. Where does this leave the United States? Here is the uncomfortable truth that no one in Washington wants to admit. The harder the United States pushes Canada, the faster Canada pulls away. And the irony is devastating because every single pressure tactic that was supposed to keep Ottawa in line has done the exact opposite. Think about what has happened over the past 2 years. The Trump administration imposed tariffs on Canadian aluminum and steel. There were public comments from senior officials about annexation that infuriated the Canadian public. Diplomatic threats were made over the fighter jet review, and at every single turn, instead of backing down, Canada dug in deeper. The pressure did not create compliance, it created resolve. And now Washington is facing a situation it never planned for, a Canada that is actively diversifying away from American dependence. Let me show you the math, because the numbers expose the real problem. If Canada reduces its F-35 order from 88 jets to just the 30 it has already committed to, that leaves 72 aircraft worth of patrol capability, that disappears from North American defence. Someone has to fill that gap. Under the North American Aerospace Defence Command, Canadian and American forces jointly protect the continent's airspace, including the massive Arctic frontier. If Canada fields fewer American-made jets or operates a fleet that Washington considers less integrated, the United States Air Force would have to increase its own patrols over Canadian airspace to maintain the defence shield. That means more American jets, more American pilots, more American taxpayer dollars covering a gap that was never supposed to exist. And here is the historical lesson Washington should have learned by now. Every time the United States has squeezed an ally too hard, that ally has found another path. In 1966, France withdrew from NATO's integrated military command because President de Gaulle refused to subordinate French defence to American control. It took over 4 decades for France to fully return. The circumstances are different today, but the pattern is identical. Pressure without partnership creates fractures, not loyalty. Canada has not walked away from the alliance. It has not torn up its NORAD commitments. It has not abandoned NATO. What it has done is something far more subtle and far more powerful. It has demonstrated that a trusted partner can question the system without breaking it. And that quiet demonstration has changed the calculation for every allied nation watching from the sidelines. The final decision on those remaining 72 jets has not been made yet. But make no mistake, whatever Canada decides will echo through allied capitals for decades to come. So let us step back and look at the full picture. Because when you lay all of this out, you realise that what is happening between Canada and the United States right now is not a disagreement about which fighter jet is better. It is a battle over something far more fundamental: control. The F-35 is not just an aircraft. It is the backbone of a digital defence architecture that the United States has spent decades building. Software updates, mission data, electronic warfare libraries, maintenance systems, all of it flows through American-controlled infrastructure. Every nation that buys into that system gains incredible capability, but it also hands over a piece of its sovereignty to Washington. That was the deal, and for decades nobody questioned it. Canada just questioned it, out loud, in front of the entire alliance, and the world is watching what happens next. This is not about one country buying a Swedish jet. This is about the future of how Western democracies defend themselves. It is about whether allied nations will continue to accept a model where technological integration comes with strings attached, where buying American weapons means operating under American oversight, where sovereignty is something you negotiate rather than something you own. The dominoes are already in motion. Finland is watching. Norway is watching. Australia, South Korea, Japan, every single partner nation inside the F-35 program is quietly recalculating. Not because the jet is flawed, but because Canada proved that you can ask the hard questions and still remain a trusted ally. That precedent is more powerful than any weapons system ever built. And the most ironic part of this entire story is that it did not have to happen this way. If Washington had treated Canada as an equal partner instead of a guaranteed customer, or if the F-35 program had delivered on its original cost promises instead of blowing past them by billions, if the Trump administration had chosen diplomacy over threats, we might not be having this conversation today. But here we are, the final decision on Canada's remaining fighter jets is coming. And when it drops, it will not just reshape Canadian defence. It will send a signal to every allied capital on Earth about what the future of Western security really looks like. This story is far from over. If you want to be the first to know what happens next, subscribe right now and hit that notification bell. Share this video with anyone who needs to understand what is really going on between Washington and Ottawa, because the mainstream media is not covering the full story. We are, and the moment the next development breaks, you will hear it here first. Stay sharp, stay informed. I will see you in the next one.